The bell rang, signaling the end of another grueling day at Crestwood High. But for Emily, the day was far from over. Her heart pounded as she stood frozen in the dimly lit school bathroom, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside, growing louder with each passing second. She knew she couldn't stay there, not after what she'd just seen. Her mind raced, replaying the scene in the principal's office over and over again. The way he'd looked at her, the way his voice had dropped to a chilling whisper, the way he'd slammed the door shut behind her. It wasn't right. None of it was right. And now, she had no choice but to run. Emily burst out of the bathroom, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as she sprinted down the empty hallway. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders, but she didn't care. She had to find someone, anyone, who could help. Her thoughts were a blur, but one name kept repeating in her head. Mr. Thompson, the janitor. He was always kind, always there with a smile or a joke, even when the rest of the school seemed to ignore him. If anyone would listen, it would be him. She rounded the corner, her chest heaving, and there he was, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies near the lockers. His back was turned, but she didn't hesitate. "Mr. Thompson!" she called out, her voice cracking with desperation. He turned, his brow furrowing as he took in her panicked expression. "Emily, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words caught in her throat. How could she even begin to describe what had just happened? How could she make him understand the gravity of what she'd witnessed? Before she could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind her. She froze, her blood turning to ice. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The principal. His voice boomed down the hallway, sharp and commanding. "Emily, stop right there." She glanced at Mr. Thompson, her eyes pleading for help. He hesitated for just a moment, his gaze flickering between her and the approaching figure. Then, without a word, he stepped in front of her, shielding her from view. "Go," he whispered, his voice firm. "I'll handle this." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her ears as she disappeared around the corner. But even as she fled, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. What had she just stumbled into? And why was the principal so desperate to stop her from talking? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. Something was very, very wrong at Crestwood High. And Mr. Thompson might be the only one who could help her uncover the truth. As she ducked into an empty classroom, her mind raced with questions. What had the principal done? Why was he so determined to silence her? And what would happen now that Mr. Thompson was involved? She pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. But the fear wouldn't let go. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, she'd have to face the principal again. But for now, all she could do was wait, and hope that Mr. Thompson could buy her enough time to figure out her next move. The tension in the air was palpable as the principal approached Mr. Thompson, his expression unreadable. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Mr. Thompson stood his ground, his grip tightening on the handle of his mop. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied evenly, though his heart was racing. He'd always tried to stay out of the drama at Crestwood, but this was different. This was about a kid, a scared, vulnerable kid who needed his help, and he wasn't about to back down. The principal's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he might say something more. But then, without warning, he turned on his heel and stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Mr. Thompson watched him go, his mind racing. What had Emily gotten herself into? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? He knew he couldn't just stand by and let this go. But stepping in meant risking everything. His job, his reputation, maybe even his safety. Still, as he glanced down at the mop in his hands, He knew he didn't have a choice. Some things were bigger than fear. Some things were worth fighting for. Meanwhile, hidden in the shadows of the empty classroom, Emily clutched her phone, her fingers hovering over the call button. Should she call the police? Her parents? Someone had to know what was going on. But what if no one believed her? What if the principal had already covered his tracks? Her mind was a whirlwind of doubt and fear. But one thought kept breaking through the chaos. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help. And right now, Mr. Thompson was her only hope. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the school grew thicker. The principal was nowhere to be seen, but his presence loomed over every corner, every shadow. Emily knew it was only a matter of time before he found her. And when he did, she had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain. The truth was about to come out, whether the principal liked it or not. And when it did, nothing at Crestwood High would ever be the same again. Emily's fingers trembled as she scrolled through her phone, trying to decide who to call. Her parents? No, they'd just tell her to stay out of trouble. The police? What would she even say? I think the principal is hiding something. That wasn't exactly evidence. She sighed, leaning her head against the cold classroom wall. She needed proof, something concrete. But she had no idea where to start. All she had was the memory of what she'd seen, and the sinking feeling that it was only the tip of something much darker. She thought back to earlier that day, when she'd been sent to the principal's office to drop off a stack of papers for the school secretary. She'd knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Assuming he wasn't there, she'd pushed the door open slightly to leave the papers on his desk. That's when she'd heard it, the low, urgent voices coming from the back room. She'd frozen, her curiosity getting the better of her. She shouldn't have listened. She shouldn't have stayed. But she had, and now, she couldn't unhear what she'd heard. The principal's voice had been sharp, almost angry. This can't get out. Do you understand? If anyone finds out, it's over. There was a pause, and then another voice. Softer, but no, less tense. We've taken care of it. No one will know. Emily hadn't recognized the second voice, but something about it had sent chills down her spine. She'd backed away quietly, her heart racing, but as she turned to leave, she'd accidentally knocked a framed photo off the desk. The crash had been deafening, and before she could even think, the principal had burst out of the back room, his face a mask of fury. That's when she'd run. Now, hiding in the empty classroom, she replayed the scene in her mind. What had they been talking about? What couldn't get out? And who was the other person in the room? She didn't have answers, but she knew one thing. She couldn't just sit there and do nothing. She had to find out more. But how? She wasn't exactly a detective, and she didn't have any allies, except maybe Mr. Thompson. But even he seemed like a long shot. He was just the janitor after all. What could he really do? As if on cue, the classroom door creaked open, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself further into the shadows, her heart pounding. But it wasn't the principal. It was Mr. Thompson. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. Emily, he said softly, closing the door behind him. Are you okay? She nodded, though her hands were still shaking. I think so. But I don't know what to do. He's going to find me. I know it. Mr. Thompson sighed, running, a hand through his graying hair. Listen, kid. I don't know what's going on here, but I know it's serious. You're not the type to run like this unless something's really wrong. So, tell me, what did you see? Emily hesitated. Could she trust him? She barely knew him, but he'd stood up for her in the hallway. That had to count for something. Taking a deep breath, she told him everything. The voices, the tension, the photo she'd knocked over. and the way the principal had looked at her when she'd run. When she finished, Mr. Thompson's face was grim. "That's not good," he muttered. "Not good at all." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean," Mr. Thompson said, "that this isn't the first time I've heard whispers about the principal. There's been rumors, things people don't talk about out loud. But if what you're saying is true, then it's worse than I thought." Emily's eyes widened. "What kind of rumors?" He hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "Look, I don't know much, just bits and pieces, but there's been talk about money, missing money, and not just a little, a lot. Some people think it's tied to the new construction project. You know, the one they've been pushing so hard?" Emily nodded. The school had been buzzing about the new gymnasium for months. It was supposed to be state-of-the-art, but the project had been delayed over and over again. No one seemed to know why. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice low. "There's also been talk about other things. Things I don't even want to repeat. But if the principal's involved, then it's bad. Really bad." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "What do we do? We can't just let this go." "We don't do anything," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "Not yet. We need proof. Without it, it's just your word against his. And trust me, no one's going to believe a kid over the principal." "But what if he finds me first?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Thompson's expression softened. "He won't. Not if I have anything to say about it. But you need to be careful. Stay out of sight. Don't trust anyone. And whatever you do, don't go home." "Not yet." Emily nodded, though the thought of not going home made her chest ache. Where would she go? Who could she trust? She didn't have answers, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stay in the classroom forever. Sooner or later, someone would find her. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "This is for the storage closet in the basement. It's out of the way, and no one ever goes down there. You'll be safe there for now. I'll bring you some food and water later, okay?" Emily took the key, her fingers closing around it tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Mr. Thompson gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of the woods, but we'll figure this out. Together." As he left the room, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't alone after all. But as she made her way to the basement, her mind raced with questions. What was the principal hiding? And how deep did it go? She didn't have answers, but she knew one thing. She was in way over her head, and if she wasn't careful, she might not make it out of this alive. The storage closet was small and cramped, with boxes piled high against the walls. Emily sat down on the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She felt like a fugitive, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next move. But she didn't have a choice. Not now, not with so much at stake. As the hours passed, the silence of the basement pressed in on her. Every creak, every distant sound, made her jump. She kept replaying the conversation with Mr. Thompson in her mind. Missing money, rumors, the construction project. It all seemed connected, but she couldn't figure out how. And then there was the other voice, the one she hadn't recognized. Who was it? And what role did they play in all of this? She didn't have answers, but she knew one thing. She couldn't just sit there and wait for someone else to fix this. She had to do something. But what? She wasn't exactly equipped to take on the principal and whatever he was hiding. But she couldn't just do nothing, not when so much was at stake. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the small basement window, Emily made a decision. She didn't know how, but she was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. And if that meant putting herself in danger, then so be it. She couldn't let this go. Not now. Not ever. But as she sat there, her resolve hardening, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That somewhere, in the shadows, someone was waiting. And when they made their move, she wouldn't be ready. Not even close.